Well, first I'd like to thank Harjot very much for inviting me here, and indeed to all the organisers for bringing me all this way. It's been a great pleasure to come and see Vancouver and actually to find that something sort of like Australia is not actually that far away at all. I've certainly heard quite a few Australian accents on the streets. Okay, so today what I'd like to do is, in a way, go over some of the main arguments of my new book, which is going to come out in August, but hopefully spare you some of the painful details and certainly the more painful footnotes. I suppose many of us, if we think about Islam in Southeast Asia and certainly of Islam in Indonesia, we have an idea of something that's probably set in juxtaposition to Islam's elsewhere, probably unfair juxtapositions. Sometimes we are told that Indonesian Islam is somehow more peaceful, it's more tolerant, and above all, it's more mystical, although that's never quite explained. It's Islam with an Asian rather than an Arab face. And sometimes it's held up as a sort of a solution, some sort of palliative to global extremism, much as Indonesia's post-Suharto democratisation is now being proposed as an example for the modern Middle East. Indeed, the story of Indonesian Islam, and I should say that the term Indonesian Islam is more often used by outsiders than Indonesians themselves, who more often speak of Islam in Indonesia than of Indonesia, is usually explained by a very short story, and that is that Islam came to Southeast Asia in the 13th century rather than at the time of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, that it was trade and not conquest that had brought it, and then more specifically, it must have been Indian mystics who did so, who were able to bring their particular softened take on Islam to a population who were more used to dealing with other Indic religions. Indeed, the assertion is often made that there were a specific sort of mystic, members of tariqas, that is, of special mystical brotherhoods or fraternities, who had brought Islam in the first place. Although, as I hope to show today, there's a bit of a problem with this idea. Now, certainly Indonesians are rather photogenic and apparently all too willing to be represented as exemplars on a global stage. Prominent Indonesian intellectuals have also gladly restated the thesis of Sufism or yet cultural adaptation, or even referred to something known as cultural Islam to explain how and why Islam is the way it is in Indonesia. They say that the form that has been taken on by the majority of their countrymen by adapting particular forms, be they of the shadow puppetry or of the gamelan orchestras, that are sometimes attributed as being the inventions of some of the earliest saints who trod the soil of Java in perhaps the 15th century. Now, even if some of this might be true, much of the apparently agreed story that we have today has been shaped by modernity rather than tradition, and by the colonial encounter in particular. It's a story of how certain Indonesians, for want of a better term, because it is, after all, a modern term, chose to represent themselves, and how the Dutch, in turn, picked and chose from the array of images on offer. Now today, after something of a long historical preamble, and I have to admit I'm a historian, not a political scientist or a sociologist or a journalist, I want to show how the traditional image that we have now is established as a useful past, one to be supplanted ultimately by a modern future. And in closing, I will suggest that once the future failed to deliver, observers and Indonesians alike have reverted to the former, seeing a far better past than perhaps there ever was. Now, this probably doesn't make a lot of sense at the moment, so I hope you'll bear with me. And by the time I'm done with it, or you're done with me, I hope you've got a bit of a better sense of what I'm on about. Now, speaking of images, I'd like to start with one in particular. What we have here is actually the evidence of a transaction rather than just a straightforward image of a Muslim saint. This was found in the papers of a certain Dutch Orientalist known as Christiaan Snoeck, which is a particularly horrible name. It sounds more like a throat infection than a family name. It's perhaps better just to refer to him as Snoek, which was one of his family names. And Snoek is going to take something of centre stage in much of what I'm going to say later. It's a picture that was given to him at some point in the 1890s by a Muslim official on the island of Lombok. It's clearly designed to be hung on a wall. It's got a nice loop of cotton at the top there. And it's said to portray a particular foundational saint of the island of Lombok, whom I haven't been able to get anyone to identify for me, someone known as Haji Bauk. What's interesting about this saint is the representation is clearly of a Sufi, or at least the sort of Sufi that could still be photographed roaming in the Middle East at the end of the 19th century, carrying, in this case, a Quran in a bag under his shoulder, represented as something more akin to an Arab than an Indonesian. He's certainly, the style of beard would make an Indonesian think that this is more an Arab than an Indonesian. Although, interestingly, he carries a Javanese spear. He has a turban which, in some senses, could be mistaken for having a Chinese cloud pattern in the fabric. He wears a sarong, or at least you can see the top of an Indonesian sarong. And I think it's a rather nice touch, apart from the Javanese spear, is it looks rather more like a Dutch jacket than anything else. So he's a composite figure. And I think it's an interesting story to start with because you have the image of an idealised saint presented to a Dutch scholar who was trying to work out what on earth was the Islam that he and his colleagues were dealing with in Southeast Asia, in the lands that he later referred to as just happening to have fallen by an accident of history under Dutch rule. But this was no accident. Now, the area I'm going to be talking about today, or what became Indonesia, is largely set across the very vast canvas of Southeast Asia, island Southeast Asia, from the great island of Sumatra in the west, across to the Lesser Sunda Islands, heading towards the island of New Guinea, and then, of course, the famous Borneo and Sulawesi and the Moluccas to the further east. And of course, the Moluccas were known in history as the origin of many of the famous spices that were used in the kitchens and courts of ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, and ancient China. Indeed, the spices have long been making their way from this small, well, relatively remote part of the world into these places for hundreds of years and have drawn, naturally, traders in quest of those spices. But while we've had trade for a long, long time, we're not quite sure when exactly the first Muslim traders set foot in Southeast Asia. Indeed, we do have references in both Arabic and Chinese sources that talk about the islands of which we can identify as Southeast Asia. And there are hints sometimes to names of people that could be Muslim, they might not. But it's really only in the 13th century, at least, that we have some sort of substantive record of some sort of Muslim or perhaps political Muslim presence in the form of gravestones. Indeed, Marco Polo, who claims to have journeyed through the region in 1292, referred to small communities of Muslims along the coast of Sumatra, although he described them as being sort of walled off from the neighbouring communities. Similarly, Ibn Battuta, who travelled through in the 1340s, spoke about the recently converted kingdoms of North Sumatra, and he spoke of people who were very interested in the Shafi'i. It's a particular school of Sunni jurisprudence. And he spoke about the warm welcome that he received when he was there. Now, we're able to date this as well because we do have some gravestones from the late 13th century. And these have been studied again and again and again by many Dutch epigraphers. But they're in fact rather earlier stones that seem to come from the early 13th century. But that said, they don't tell us anything much about the how or the why as to why people adopted Islam. At any rate, by the time the Portuguese turned up in the 16th century, they found established Muslim kingdoms, most notably that of Malacca, which was the key entrepot in the trade between China and the West, the broader West, I mean. Indeed, the Portuguese were so eager to take over this trade that they thought that with the capture of Malacca in 1511, they would pretty much have their hands on the throat of Venice, and indeed that they would have control of the great global trade. Such was not to be the case, and indeed a lot of the traders shifted their operations elsewhere. But it's interesting that the first depictions of the Muslims in the archipelago are not particularly informative in the Portuguese texts. And the images, for example, here of the Achinese, who are perhaps best known for their use of blowpipes in battle, weren't that different from the depictions of quite a number of other communities in Southeast Asia and up in mainland Southeast Asia too, I should say. At any rate, by the time the Dutch turn up into the story and make their way, not entirely peacefully, out to the Moluccas by the end of the 16th century, they found that Islam had certainly taken firm root out in the far reaches of the archipelago, and indeed had strong connections with other parts of the archipelago, whether the north coast of Java or across to the Straits of Malacca. But for the Dutch, Islam was not exactly a new thing. Indeed, a lot of the early descriptions of Asia by Dutch explorers spend far more time talking about the rather scary religious traditions that they encountered in India, or perhaps talking about Buddhism, than Islam, which was something that many Dutchmen believed that they already knew quite something about due to their long traffic with the Muslims of North Africa in particular. Indeed, the story of the relationship between the Dutch and the Muslim world has not always been particularly negative. And indeed, we have evidence of missions being sent from Morocco to talk about alliances with the Dutch against the Spanish at various times. But what we do have with this image here from Ternate, a small speck of a volcanic island out in the Moluccas, is a clear depiction of a royal procession to the mosque, which we see at left here, which is rather different to perhaps the image of a mosque you might have, with the pots outside for the washing of the ritual washing before prayer. And at the centre of the procession, we see what some might interpret perhaps as clear evidence of Sufism being an active or primary part of religious practice there. Because what you see here is under the royal parasol, the king himself is carrying a set of prayer beads. And prayer beads, the sibha, is usually associated with Sufi practice. It's used for counting the numerous prayers that people must, that a Sufi will make over the course of a day. But I think I perhaps should say a little bit about Sufism here, because Sufism does not necessarily just mean anything related to the tariqas. In fact, it's a far broader category. The notion of mysticism can take in philosophical mysticism, indeed the sorts of mysticism or mystical poetry that many of us might be perhaps more familiar with. I'm sure you did copies of Rumi and people like that, are not necessarily the books that were being consumed by members of the Sufi brotherhoods. But from here on, when I do talk about mystics and Sufis, I am talking about the members of the tariqas. Now, a tariqa literally just means a path, and it's a path to God. Now, arranged in fraternities, this would be where you would have a number of people would pledge themselves to a particular teacher in the hope of gaining some special insight or knowledge of how to communicate or understand the relationship between themselves and the divine. Now, different Sufi orders, which are often named after the putative founder of an order, be they the Naqshbandiya or the Shatariya or the Qadiriya, often have different forms of practice, which is generally referred to as dhikr, which is literally remembrance. Now, some sorts of dhikr can involve silent contemplation. Other forms of dhikr might perhaps involve some of the more spectacular things you might have seen, whether the whirling dervishes of Turkey or of Sudan, or perhaps even the dabus, the rituals that are practiced among the Malays of South Africa, which involve the piercing with awls or the burning of hands, or the apparent burning of hands. Now, a member of a tariqa would usually associate with the teacher on the understanding that the teacher was a good exemplar of proper knowledge of Sharia, of Islamic law, and would make a pact of allegiance to that teacher, known as a bay'ah. And technically they should place themselves under the authority of the teacher. Now, of course, a specially gifted student who might be recognised for his or her insight could ultimately hope perhaps to represent the teacher elsewhere, perhaps to gain other adepts, and perhaps even to ascend and become a teacher, more likely himself than herself, I should say. The thing to point out about tariqas, though, is that they're not designed for everybody. Indeed, the tariqa, or classically speaking when talking about tariqa practice was usually associated with a learned elite, or at least in theory it was supposed to be restricted to the learned elite. So kings literati, people like that, particularly in Southeast Asia. Although in the Middle East we see the emergence in other periods of tariqas being associated with particular trades in some places. But certainly in Southeast Asia it seemed to be much more restricted to an elite. And indeed, the policing of tariqa practice seems to have been a constant in Southeast Asian history. It's not just a straightforward story of certain people gravitating to particular teachers and finding that they were in the same circles as the rulers. There seem to be stories time and time again, and certainly the legends speak of stories of particular teachers who transgressed both the Sharia and, of course, the royal writ, and were ultimately given the final sanction for their actions, for denying Sharia, denying God, and therefore denying their membership of the community. It's also clear that the arrival of the latest form of tariqa learning, which was usually imported from Mecca, I should say, and indeed in many Southeast Asian texts, they often talk about the primary authority of Mecca as where all religious authority should come from. There's often a story of contestation, and indeed perhaps one of the most famous stories of contestation occurred in the early part of the 17th century in the shores of the very rich kingdom of Aceh, when a recent arrival came and condemned the Sufi texts that were being promulgated in the kingdom. This man was known as Nuruddin Raniri, the guy who condemned the local texts and ultimately supplanted those teachers, having one in particular executed and having the books of his followers destroyed. So he's not exactly the most tolerant exemplar of Sufism, you might say. And indeed, he came to control or dictate a lot of policy in the Sultanate at the time. Now, this story is often held up as a sort of a paradigmatic story of outside Islam coming and encountering traditional peaceful Indonesian Islam. But actually, he himself was supplanted and kicked out later on. And it also seems that this particular person who had come from Gujarat may well have already been familiar with Malay and perhaps may even have had a Malay parent. So it's too simple to just say it's a story of an outsider coming in and trying to police orthodoxy. In the meantime, though, the Dutch, and they're an important part of this story, the Dutch East India Company was steadily gaining ground in Southeast Asia, from their bases first in the Moluccas and then in Java, and eating away at various Indonesian kingdoms and territories, often in exchange for offering their forces at the service of the rulers, be they of Java or other places. And of course, every Dutch person knows about Jan Koen, a particularly nasty zealot, a religious zealot, I should say, who even arranged for the wholesale deportation and massacre of the population of the island of Banda in order to secure the monopoly on the production of nutmeg. Now, certainly the Dutch were being noticed by the various Southeast Asian Muslim polities, but it didn't necessarily mean that they were all getting together to chase the Dutch out of the archipelago. Rather, the Dutch remained an obvious minority in a rather cosmopolitan world and continued to take on local kingdoms in a piecemeal fashion. In fact, there were lots of other players in Southeast Asia, be they Chinese, be they Indian, be they Burmese, Assamese, whatever. Still, they didn't always get what they want, and perhaps in Indonesian national history, one of the most famous people ever to have led any resistance against the Dutch was himself a Sufi teacher. And this is Sheikh Yusuf of Makassar. Born on the island of Sulawesi, he went first to West Java, then he went to Aceh, and then he went and studied for many years in the Middle East, in Yemen and in the holy cities. On his return to the archipelago, he formed a strong relationship with the royal court of West Java, and indeed when the Dutch intervened in a succession dispute in the 17th century, he actually led the resistance for a time, before he and what the Dutch referred to as his temple popes, his followers, were sent into exile to Sri Lanka. And then, when they were concerned about the writings that he was disseminating, and they thought were destined for the archipelago, he was exiled even further to Cape Town, where he was buried the first time. I should say his remains were repatriated to Sulawesi, and he's now buried, some people believe he's buried in both places, or even in more than two places, but I can get into that later if you'd like. That said, even while the Dutch were anxious about figures like Sheikh Yusuf, a great Sufi and leader of people against them, it didn't necessarily mean that they were super concerned about Islam per se. Indeed, there's evidence in the 18th century that the Dutch even encouraged the Islamization of the last Hindu kingdom of East Java, because they felt that it was far easier to deal with Muslim rulers than it was to deal with Balinese. Rather, the story about Dutch anxieties, and I should say metropolitan Dutch anxieties about Islam, really grows in the 19th century. And that's when, in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, when there'd been a British interregnum, the old Dutch East India Company had been wiped out, and the Dutch decided to move in and sort of rule more directly in the archipelago, they found that the Indonesians weren't necessarily willing to have them back. And they faced two major uprisings. Perhaps the most important was that led on Java by Prince Diponegoro, who was able to raise huge numbers of people to his cause against the Dutch and against the corrupt Sultanate of Yogyakarta, of which he was a member. He was able to raise huge numbers of people from the network of Islamic schools that had now sort of appeared on Java. Now, I should say, one of the things that's often spoken about of being an age-old part of Islam in Indonesia is the religious school, the Pesantren. And yet, we don't really have a lot of evidence of Pesantren being in the form that they are today until sort of the 18th century. Indeed, they seem to grow very much in the wake of the decline of regal authority on Java, and perhaps in part because they were allowed to continue trading without any interference from the Dutch, and they didn't have to pay taxes to the Dutch elite. The other important Islamic resistance the Dutch faced was in West Sumatra, when they fought against people that they disdainfully referred to as the Padri. Basically, it's a corruption of the term padre for Catholic priest. Now, the Padri movement had actually begun not as an anti-colonial war, but rather as a puritanical movement in West Sumatra itself, stimulated by the arrival of pilgrims who were trying to change the practices of their fellow West Sumatrans. They were trying to stop people gambling at cockfighting arenas. They were trying to stop people drinking alcohol. They were trying to stop people basically having a good time to a certain degree, you might say. Yet when the Dutch decided in the wake of the Java War, having secured their rule there, to intervene, they found that the situation changed and they faced rather an Islamic resistance against them. Now, the Dutch were rather confused by the ideological nature of what they faced. And a lot of subsequent scholarship has suggested, usually, that the Padris in particular must have been some sort of Wahhabi, because the pilgrims had been to Mecca at the time of the first Wahhabi conquest of the Holy City. I would say that we need to be a little bit more cautious about this, because the sorts of material that was captured from these resistors was often actually textual evidence of an attraction not so much to the teachings of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, but rather to certain forms of mystical learning, tariqah learning. So what I would suggest, even if the Dutch might have been thinking of what we might anachronistically refer to as like Salafi jihadism, we could actually talk about Sufi jihadists just as equally. And indeed, regardless of their precise doctrinal affiliation, the leaders of the war, for example, Diponegoro in Java and Imam Bonjol in West Sumatra, are certainly celebrated today as Indonesian national heroes. But of course, they weren't necessarily fighting at the time for something that we might refer to as Indonesia. They were rather much more local concerned. At any rate, the Dutch observers agreed that the problem to their continued rule in Southeast Asia stemmed from Mecca. And we have here at left a rather fanciful illustration or a Dutch imagination of what a Javanese pilgrim and his wife must look like when they're carrying out the rituals of the Hajj. This is from a book that appeared in the 1850s. The first volume, I should say, on one of the first series ever published of Religions of the World. The Dutch were actually one of the first academic traditions to start doing this. And they'd noticed, and many colonial officials noticed with increasing concern, the numbers of Arabs, or at least people in turbans that they didn't quite know much about, and increasing numbers of pilgrims who were making the effort to get all the way across the Indian Ocean to carry out the pilgrimage and then to return, often as very respected members of their home societies. Now, things became all the worse for the Dutch when, with the predicted turn of the new Muslim century in what would have been 1882, all the Foreign Office files in the Dutch and the English legations from the Ottoman Empire and into India and into Singapore were awake to rumours of an impending plot. This plot was going to be hatched by the Sufis, and I should say it was going to be hatched in Mecca, perhaps with the assistance of the Sharif of Mecca, perhaps with the assistance of the Ottoman Sultan, and that they were going to, through these tariqa networks, going to activate people and carry out a giant anti-colonial massacre. These fears were real, but the plot was fanciful. But what on later investigation the Dutch did find was that there was indeed much greater traffic between Southeast Asia and Mecca, particularly since the opening of the Suez Canal, when ever more shipping was able to carry people in both directions, and of course ever more money was able to be made from the shipping of pilgrims. So they realised that they had to finally work out what exactly the connection was between the Sufi orders, between the teachers in Mecca, and between the peoples that they often described, perhaps too simplistically, as not real Muslims at all. In fact, if you read Dutch missionary literature from the 1850s and 1860s, the constant refrain is that the Javanese in particular is at best a surface Muslim. You just scratch the surface and you find the Hindu underneath. At any rate, this is where the horribly named Christian Snuchachronia comes into the story. A cocky young Orientalist, he was hired at the age of 28 to undertake a mission to Jeddah in 1884 to survey and interview the various pilgrims as they passed through the gates of the Dutch consulate. I should say the Dutch had been trying to make the Hajj somewhat difficult for people from Southeast Asia. They had instigated a very expensive set of pass regulations. You had to have the permission of your local official before you could make the Hajj. You had to prove that you had enough money to support your family in your absence, and also to pay for a ticket to bring you back. At any rate, Snook decided to go somewhat further than just interviewing the various pilgrims and photographing them. And we have here just some of the images of pilgrims from all across Indonesia. At the top right, we have people from Sulawesi. At the bottom, we have a royal prince from Bacan in the Moluccas. At left, we have two pilgrims from Java, from Sukapura. And at the top, we have the rather arresting image of a woman from Banten. And I should say, too, that it wasn't just men making the pilgrimage. It was families, it was men and women. And they were returning in ever greater numbers, particularly to West Java, as it turned out. Indeed, by the mid-1880s, and I think 1892 in particular, there were more pilgrims making the Hajj from Southeast Asia than any other one sort of ethnic community, in fact, even outnumbering the pilgrims from India. And they, in fact, created a sizable and rather lucrative community to look to. Now, Snook felt that hanging around in Jeddah wasn't quite enough, and indeed, with the aid of a Javanese informant, and I use the term informant here very loosely because he shouldn't just be seen as an informant, but rather as Snook's teacher and instructor. It was with the aid of a number of these people that Snook decided to convert to Islam and make the journey to Mecca himself in order to see what went on at the holy city. And while he was there for some months in 1885, before he was kicked out of the city for something altogether else, he was able to observe how the pilgrims, or at least to hear the stories of how many of the Southeast Asian pilgrims would come, and not only would they carry out the rituals of the Hajj, they would also generally head straight to the doors of one of the leading Sufis of the small hillock known as Jabal Abi Qubais, which used to overlook the sacred precinct of Mecca. And indeed, it was here that many Indonesians would be brought before one of the sheikhs and apparently, with very little bother, would be able to pledge themselves to the sheikh and become members of the Naqshbandiya fraternity. Snook also had quite a lot of interesting conversations with pilgrims from across the archipelago, including the, I'm afraid, badly developed exposed image here of one Sufi sheikh, Ahmad Lampung from Sumatra, who was one of these Sufi teachers, who spoke at length with Snook about if only the Indonesians or the various peoples of what were known to the Meccans as the Jawa world had got together and been able to expel the Dutch, they could have, created one mighty Jawi empire. Snook also noticed that the sheikhs like Ahmad Lampung were very actively using modern printed materials. They were using books. It wasn't just a story of manuscripts and secret oral communications, but rather they were actively investing in things that were coming off the presses of Singapore, of Bombay, Istanbul, and just recently, Mecca itself. Indeed, it became clear to Snook that the Naqshbandiya order, above all, was gaining great numbers of adepts in Southeast Asia. Now, if we look at the evidence from Java itself in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, this is actually quite clear. We see lots of evidence of arguments between rival Sufi factions, arguments about when do you start the month of Ramadan. There are arguments that some say it should be by calculation, others say it should be by the witnessing of the new moon. There are also arguments that seem to connect to Naqshbandis in Madiun in the 1860s, where we find these Naqshbandis, rather than being tolerant exemplars, they start to name or label non-observant Javanese as being ruddy ones, abangan, not really very religious people, and talking about themselves in contradistinction as being the true white ones, the true putihan. So, not only were they offering a shorter path to enlightenment and to as many people as possible, but they were also holding themselves up as the new true orthodoxy. Now, this didn't please everybody, and perhaps one of the most displeased people was Sayyid Uthman, an Arab teacher located in the colonial capital of Batavia. He also had a printing press, and he had long tried to disseminate his own views and to try to set himself up under the Dutch, I should say, as the key authority for Islam for the Jawi people. He printed primers, he printed Hajj guides, he printed dictionaries, and he also printed very vituperative critiques of the Naqshbandis in particular, saying that, they take anyone in. In fact, he started to cast them as an incipient danger to the colonial state. And indeed, his words seemed to come true when, in 1888, members of one of these Sufi brotherhoods, with connections to Abdul Karim Banten in Mecca, actually organised themselves, and there was staged a minor uprising in the town of Cilegon in West Java. Now, all this was very useful for Snook Okrani, who had just written a 2-volume work on Mecca and spoken about the potential dangers of the Sufis. He'd also, in fact, been corresponding actively with Sayyid Uthman. They had a relationship in terms of they had a shared vision of what proper Islamic practice was, and that proper Islamic practice did not necessarily include the Sufi rituals of the Naqshbandiya. At any rate, this got Snook a fresh job, which was to advise the colonial state on Islam in their colony and in Java above all else. And he was able, over the course of 1889, 1890 and early 1891, to travel from town to town of Java to carry out surveys of how exactly Islam was organised. How was money collected for the mosque? How are mosques kept up? How are the Islamic courts organised? Who were the teachers? What were the books they used? And indeed, what were the sorts of teachings that they advocated? But he couldn't do this by himself, and nobody can. And indeed, a crucial helper in this endeavour was a young West Javanese whom he claimed to have met in Mecca, although this is rather unclear. This is Hassan Mustafa. And Hassan Mustafa was able to give him the right introductions, to declare that this Dutchman, who went by the name of Abdul Ghaffar, was indeed a true Muslim, and was able to assist in the procuring of manuscripts, which had previously been very difficult to get hold of, or even to copy other manuscripts for Snook's collection. But what really happened in this journey was that Snook, now with the job he needed, and perhaps not so great a need to scare the colonial authorities into the dangers of Islam in order to give him a job, he started to change his focus in the course of his research. And indeed, the collection of manuscripts which he really focused on, to the exclusion of the many, many printed books that he was seeing everywhere, was now more about his own endeavours to find out about how Islam had come to Indonesia. And he wrote about this explicitly, that he was collecting the manuscripts in order to shed light on how the tariqas had come to Southeast Asia, how it was that Indic mysticism had somehow fused with the tariqa mysticism. That said, he never finished that project, he never wrote that book, and rather he just continued to collect those manuscripts, many hundreds of manuscripts, which are now a core part of the collection of Leiden University in the Netherlands. Indeed, Snoek is probably better remembered today for his role in being, well, he cast himself as the guy who solved the problem of the resistance of the Acehnese in the north of Sumatra, who had been fighting against the Dutch since 1873, and whose many fighters were often captured or killed, bearing Sufi amulets on their persons or carrying with them particular texts associated with the Sufi tradition. And indeed, Snoek's role in this conflict as providing in a third unpublished volume sort of instructions as to how to set up mobile bands to target the ulama and to hunt them down where they could, has certainly, for Indonesians today, is seen as the ultimate act of betrayal. At any rate, things do not necessarily always go well for Snoek, and indeed he himself became somewhat jaded with the colonial endeavour, and particularly when he tried to advocate increasing education for the Indonesian elite. He felt that through exposure to Dutch education, Western education, that Indonesians would ultimately decide to privatise Islam to their person and leave off claims of political authority, of sovereignty, and certainly the doctrine of jihad, which he felt was an outmoded doctrine that had to be just put aside. And in his stead, and in the office that he had been tasked with heading, the Office of Native and Arab Affairs, his followers very much perpetuated his message. And for them, they often cut their teeth on Sufi manuscripts to write their dissertations in Leiden before heading out to carry out the practical role of advising the colonial state on Islam. But at all times, their work would have been impossible had it not been for the contributions, for the information that was given to them by their elite Indonesian interlocutors. Indeed, some of their interlocutors, who were spread, I should say, from Mecca to the Indies itself, came from rather interesting circles. One of Snoek's primary friends in Mecca was in fact a Sufi teacher known as Abdullah Zawawi, seen here at left. And it was through his influence and connections with a series of reformers who were based in Singapore that the first, you could say, modernist Islamic periodical appeared in Southeast Asia, very much modelled on the writings of Muhammad Abduh and Rashid Rida in Cairo. These were people with a very global vision and were constantly trying to reform, as far as they were concerned, Islamic practice in Southeast Asia. And if you read their articles, they're constantly critiquing practices of Sufis as being the sorts of things that had made Indonesians lose their way, that had caused them, or Malays as well, had caused them to be colonised because of their lack of concern with this worldly affairs. Now, in Java too, reformers of a very similar sort of hue were very active, particularly in 1911 and 1912, in setting up associations. Arguably the first most important national association in Indonesia is Sarekat Islam, founded in 1911. Not strictly a reformist Islamic organisation, but it took within it many people of that sort of persuasion who argued that Indonesians themselves shouldn't have to just wait for the Dutch. They should be setting up schools, setting up orphanages, setting up hospitals, and moving ever forward into modernity. And initially, they were resisted by quite some of the Sufi teachers who were worried that they would be losing some of their followers. But ultimately, some Sufis in some parts of Indonesia came to see that it was probably better to, if you can't beat them, you should join them. And in fact, in some branches of the Sarekat Islam, for example, in West Sumatra, the local Sufi teachers were actually members of the organisation as well. Now, I should say that the Dutch looked upon this initially with a very kind eye. They thought here was an example of Indonesians lifting themselves up by their bootstraps. They weren't calling for independence. They certainly weren't. They would often begin their meetings with a prayer for the Dutch Queen. They would wave the Dutch flag. And they would talk about their loyalty to the Dutch state. And then they would get on with the business at hand. However, Within a few years, by the end of the First World War and the increasingly hollow promises of Western governments, the tone began to change, and more Indonesians were not going to put up with, and they started to emphasise the Islam in the Syarikat Islam, I should say. Whereas the Governor-General had previously said that the Islam was really, for Syarikat Islam, it was just Islam with a small I. You know, this was really just the background faith of these people who weren't really into that. But they began to see, with rather greater concern and worry, the way that Syarikat Islam was moving and becoming active. And indeed, it was rather bad luck for Syarikat Islam that one sort of grouping of members of Syarikat Islam in the small town of Garut was exposed in 1919 when a small-scale teacher was wrongfully, he was basically killed by the colonial authorities for refusing to hand over grain. This exposed a so-called secret cell of the Syarikat Islam, and the Dutch were able to sort of clamp down on it thereafter, make life very difficult for the Syarikat Islam. In the meantime, many other organisations were forming, most notably the socialists or the leftists and the Nationalist Party, which was gaining steam at this time, although I don't have time to talk about that now. That said, the Islam and the connection between Islam and nationhood had not gone out, and indeed among the students of Cairo, it was very clear that they had a rather different conception of the future nation to come. And indeed, the very map that was on the cover of their journal, which spoke about the united world of their beloved people. This included students from what is now Indonesia, Malaya, and Siam, Thailand, who decided to annex all of Siam for the map. Felt that the world that they were that they belonged to, in which that they would live to see, was rather different to the post-colonial states that we see today. I should say though that there was no one vision though of the sort of Islam that the nation of the future should have. Indeed, many of these people who were connected to these reformist concerns, particularly the members of Al Imam from Singapore and their followers in Sumatra, the successors, were actually looked at with some horror by many of the established teachers on Java who'd been involved in that earlier mode of the transition of modern printed writings. And indeed, with the fall of Mecca to the Wahhabis again in 1926, and the claims of people who are affiliated with these reformist organisations to represent Islam on the world stage, this saw the foundation in Java of another organisation, Nahdlatul Ulama, the Renaissance of the Ulama, who sought to defend what they viewed as the real Islam, the traditional Islam, that included space for the tariqas, the Sufi teachers, but also it maintained the use of so many of the texts, the classical texts of learning, that some of these new reformers seemed to be sweeping away. In the meantime, men like Agus Salim, who had taken over Syarikat Islam effectively and turned it into a more religiously oriented organisation, and who had ultimately become the Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Republic of Indonesia, set about writing more and more about the history of Islam in Southeast Asia, and increasingly casting Sufism and tariqat as part of the early stages of Indonesia's development. Now, it's always, and I think largely the story had been pretty much stuck now, that it must have been Sufis in some way who had converted Indonesia. And people tended not to argue with this. They might argue about contemporary practices. It's always fine to say that the Sufis of the past were very pious people. But if it's the snake oil salesman of today, or that's a different sort of matter. So everyone could sort of agree on the Sufi past, but disagree about the praxis of the present. Certainly with Japanese occupation, and indeed the ascent of the nationalists who were not so explicitly connected to the Muslim reformist project, there was no one vision of what sort of Islam Indonesia should have, the future nation of Indonesia. And indeed, there were problematic meetings held in the final days of the Japanese occupation in which there were arguments about the insertion of a phrase which stated that it would be obligatory for the Muslims in the future nation of Indonesia to carry out Sharia. Now, what did this even mean? Did it mean full Sharia in terms of, if we think in terms of hudud punishments, or did it simply mean that people should pray that was certainly not worked out. And if there was something that the people of different factions did agree upon, it was that it was just far too problematic, ultimately, to keep in the constitution of the future nation of Indonesia. And that included ideas from Agus Salim on the one hand, the sort of radical modernist, and on the other hand, you had Hashim Ash'ari, the founder of Nahdlatul Ulama, on the other hand. I mean, indeed, this decision would rather haunt the early nation of Indonesia, which would face first, of course, the war with the returning Dutch, the war for independence, and then in the 1950s, a series of revolts under the banner of Islam, the Darul Islam revolts, led, for example, in West Java by Kartosuwiryo, who had ideas of an Indonesia, but a rather different Indonesia to the one we see today. Now, these revolts were all suppressed, and suppressed rather violently indeed. And indeed, expressions of political Islam of any sort, be they connected to the Darul Islam or even to the sort of the political claims of others, for the former members of the Masyumi, for example, which I haven't spoken about, were certainly suppressed under Sukarno and then under his successor, Suharto. Now, I'm sorry if I'm racing along here, but I'm just trying to sort of bring up the tail end of the story, because I'm sure you're going to ask what happened next. Now, Suharto very much rested on sitting on top of, maintaining his legitimacy on the world stage and his relationship with the Americans, of course, by claiming to keep the Reds out of Indonesia. Indeed, he had come to power in the wake of a botched coup undertaken by the Communist Party of Indonesia. And certainly the Americans were looking, and the Australians, I should say, were quite approving of Suharto's measures in that end. But he certainly made it very difficult for political Islam to have any breathing space in Indonesia. Still, he had two rather unwelcome challenges in the 1980s. Perhaps the most important of them is at left, the Muslim intellectual Abdurrahman Wahid, the grandson of the founder of NU, who had himself gone to study in Cairo. He had a very global perspective, although it should be said that he didn't necessarily have a great time in Cairo. Indeed, he bombed out of his courses initially and ultimately went and studied, was it Iraq, where he finished his degree in Arabic literature. That said, Gustur said, the Cairo that he described was very much one of an open cosmopolitan society, a place where you could go and study French, go and see French films. It was really a great modern draw card for people indeed in the 1950s and 60s. And Gustur even claimed that for people of his generation, they saw the world through Cairo, and it's worth thinking about. Ultimately, though, Suharto, whilst continuing to repress political Islam, saw, whether for personal reasons of faith or political reasons of pragmatism, gravitated more towards Islam and famously made the Hajj himself. And this was, in fact, a key moment in Indonesian history. I understand many people can remember, the footage of Suharto undertaking the Hajj with his wife and returning. And indeed, in the 90s, there was quite a strong trend towards the Islamization of Indonesian public life. Many officials, particularly those who were affiliated with his sort of heir appointee, Yusuf Habibie, Bahruddin Yusuf Habibie, were engaged in an organisation called the Society of Indonesian Muslim Intellectuals, and there was a sort of what was spoken of as a greening of Indonesian society. Also on the university campuses, there was a great deal of interest in Islam. And this played out in very many different ways, because again, I would point out, there's not just one sort of Islam, not just one recipe that people were following. People were attracted to all sorts of different Islamic thinking and from all sorts of different directions. Now, this all spilled over with the financial crisis, which was ultimately the great undoing of Suharto, which forced his resignation. Indeed, a great many Muslim students were certainly out on the streets with many other students from the other campuses calling for his ouster. But in the wake of the fall of Suharto and the chaos that followed, lots of other things came out beyond free speech and real democracy, which Indonesia certainly moved towards. We saw the fraying of relationships between Christians and Muslims in Ambon, in the Moluccas, which led to a brief and extremely violent civil war. And indeed, as part of the violence, there were actually people organising themselves in Java under the banner of Laskar Jihad and sending people to go and participate in the conflict. Although these people who are often, there's lots of footage of them training for jihad, waving swords in the air. Most of them, though, were apparently pretty hopeless when it came to sort of fighting. Were often engaged in a lot of sort of behind-the-scenes work, da'wah, and support for the Muslim community there. This is not to say that they weren't engaged in a conflict. They certainly were. But with the Bali bombing of 2004, it became clear that there was yet another force on Indonesian soil. And perhaps this is the one that we've probably heard the most about, or had heard the most about in the wake of 2004 and up to the last couple of years, and that's the so-called Merauke network of Abu Bakr Bashir, who was often painted as being a member of the global Al-Qaeda network, who may have had communications with them, certainly. But the members of the jihadist groups in Indonesia certainly had their own concerns about, their own local concerns about what they were trying to achieve, and have ultimately been, I think through the effective work of the police in Indonesia, have been pretty much shut down. Now, I'm not going to say that this ends as a happy story, and this is only a small fragment of the political story that I've been telling here at the end. The recent attacks on members of the Ahmadiyya movement, for example, show that tolerance certainly has its political limits in Indonesia today. In part, this is due to the self-appointed Majlis Ulama Indonesia, the council of various ulama who are worried about the teachings of Ahmadiyya, which has been in Indonesia since the 1920s, when it was actually invited onto Indonesian soil by another reformist group, the Muhammadiyah. Now, the Ahmadiyya are a group that recognise or claim a prophet after Muhammad, and whilst they claim to be Muslims, many mainstream Muslims regard them as not Muslim. And recently, the Indonesian government gave backing to a fatwa of the council that said that they could not carry out propaganda, and others have used this political space to carry out attacks on the Ahmadiyya, which the government has condemned, it should be said. At any rate, I don't want to end with a political story here. I should say that tolerance and tolerant people are certainly abound in Indonesia. And I think perhaps in this, like Indonesian Islam, or the notion of Indonesian Islam, is perhaps seen as an ideal. Perhaps it's seen sometimes by others, it's cast as a stage of development by others. Often they talk about Indonesian Islam as being a sort of a syncretic moment that will ultimately pass when people sort of understand what real Islam is. Indeed, I should say, when I've spoken to students in Cairo and other places, Indonesian, and mentioned the idea of Indonesian Islam, they've usually looked at me blankly and said, well, what do you mean? There's only Islam. This idea, of course, there's a cultural inflection, but there's really only one thing. Now, that said, in trying to destabilise over the last however many minutes it was, trying to destabilise the simplistic notion that Sufism equals tolerance, I've, I suppose, fallen into a trap of telling a political story that does not do justice to the majority of Indonesians, who are indeed very tolerant people. But the reasons for this are not, I believe, to be found in some external cause, but rather within, much as we should avoid the implicit assumption that Arabs or Indian Muslims are somehow less tolerant people, because I think that's probably the biggest danger of this notion that Indonesian Islam is special or perhaps even better, and that's the idea that somehow Muslims of other places are worse. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Professor Laffan, for your elaboration, which is very, very enlightening. My first question is possibly actually a question or statement. This is regarding the role of the 9 saints, as you see, the Wali Songo, you see. Could you please elaborate further in the context of Islamization in Java? How do you see their role? And then secondly, regarding the current situation of modern Islam in Indonesia, where you mentioned clearly the new sources, the new force of Islam, yeah, as you mentioned, with the you know the role by the Abu Bakr Bashir, sorry, Abu Bakr Bashir, yeah. And now you see, we believe that this represent only a minority faction.
Yeah.
But you see the media, the press, you see, it's always highlight the role of this Abu Bakar Bashir, yeah?
Yeah.
While in fact, we feel that those who are moderates we feel that we are a bit sidelined. But on the other hand, there is also like a gap in the press, where the press often say that the moderate must speak up. Mm-hmm. But we, or the majority of Indonesians who are moderate, we try everything to be moderate in day-to-day life, which of course is not too sexy enough to be captured by the press. Mm-hmm. How do you see this issue going forward? Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, thank you so much. All right, two very different questions at very different ends of the story. First, the Wali Songo. Literally, this means the 9 saints. And they're particularly Javanese, although, of course, given that Java is so important in the modern nation of Indonesia, and indeed, if Java was a nation of its own, it would be still the largest country in Southeast Asia. So that gives you some sort of sense of the numeric numbers of the Javanese. It's held that there are these 9 saints. And indeed, on the image of Nahdlatul Ulama, you have these 9 stars. I think they're supposed to represent maybe not. But of course, nobody agrees on who the 9 exactly are. And we have various names. There are some who are definitely regarded as being in the 9 by everyone. Sunan Kalijogo, for example, or Malik Ibrahim. But then there are others where it's contested. We don't know a lot about these saints. On the one hand, Javanese are often inclined to say that particular saints invented particular cultural forms. This is where you get this argument of cultural Islam, that one saint came up with the gamelan, that another saint invented a particular poetic form known as suluk, which is related actually to the word suluk, which means travelling on the mystic path, actually. But that said, I think that there's been this sort of retrofitting of Sufi saintliness to the Wali Songo, who were undoubtedly important and powerful figures, who often seem to have been connected to North Coast trade in Java. And in some cases seem to have made alliances with Chinese. Perhaps the best example of this is Sunan Gunung Jati. If you visit his grave complex, you find that his tomb next to that of his wife, which is, and she is commemorated as being a Chinese elite. All I would say, though, is that we don't know a lot precisely about the Wali Songo, and they're rather held up as exemplars. And a lot of this idea that they were tariqa mystics is often retrofitted to them, and yet we don't find, you remember I mentioned the pedigrees, the silsilas that say that who's been taught by whom? We don't find a lot of early texts that have a clear silsila that places these figures in, and they often seem to be more recent creations. Also the notion that they set up Pesantren, religious schools. A lot of the Pesantren that exist today, I don't think any go back before the 18th century, to the best of my knowledge. So they're sort of a vehicle for explaining Islam, and yet we know very little about them. We do have graves, I should say, and we're sort of always left with that. It's the graves of the Wali Songo, which people still visit in the hope of having some sort of prayer answered or other. But of course there are other factions in Indonesia that regard this as totally anathema. Indeed, the practice of visiting graves is one that's really divided Muslims around the world. What are you supposed to get when you visit a grave? On the one hand, there's popular faith where people often posit that you'll have requests answered or mediated. And then, of course, on the other hand, you have the reformers who say that the only reason to go to a grave is to meditate or meditate on mortality. Now, back to this question of the news and Abu Bakr. I'll get there. Bashir. What struck me about the representation of Abu Bakr Bashir is that first they always say, well, he's an Arab, and somehow he's got Arab descent. And certainly he maintains that connection. And he's seen as somehow an outsider. Indeed, these groups are a minority, and that is always worth stressing. But this argument, I think you put it best yourself, this notion that people have to speak out against them. People do speak out against them, but their calls don't necessarily translate into the press or the outside press, as you say. But rather it's about the day-to-day life of the majority of Muslims in Indonesia, and I think the majority of Muslims everywhere. You know, the day-to-day praxis, which is not sexy news, but it's really about tolerance and inclusiveness, is much more the norm than these sectarians who are finding increasingly that whether they have tried through the violent path or tried through the electoral path, they're not necessarily winning the majority over.
Doctor, thank you for your edification and making me a bit more enlightened, but you've confused me. And only about the last 40 years of your timeline, in that, does religion influence politics or does politics influence religion?
Isn't it both ways? Does politics... I have to say it's both. I mean, I think that religion has been used by politicians, and I mean, if we think of politics just in terms of elections and things like that, we see that repeatedly Muslim parties have tried to organise themselves, often with the claim to reinstate the Jakarta Charter, that Sharia has to be enacted. And each time that they've tried to run on this platform or tried to get this passed, then they failed at the ballot box. But then again, there have been times where it's suited certain people to attack minorities. You have the renter crowd that can appear from nowhere, and the Islamic Defenders Front seem to be very good at this, turning up and causing problems, smashing in shop windows and things. And that seems to be connected in many cases to factions of the old order, or what was called the new order, who were often linked to the military, to Suharto and others. But I have to say, my comfort zone is much more in the colonial period. And I'm as mystified as most people, I think, when I turn up to Indonesia, trying to understand it's a very fluid situation often, and these alliances and parties often shift. And it's very hard to sort of pin one sort of Islam to any particular faction, and people seem to move between factions quite readily. I think I've probably confused you even more, but I have to admit that I'm confused.
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much for interesting information. I am a converted Muslim, and I had no idea there was Sufism in Indonesia. I think it's that's why I think Indonesians are more, good Muslims, really. Yeah, and since I converted to Islam, I have studied lots of things, including jihad also, which I didn't know before. What is jihad? Now the thing is that the Sufism has also many sects. It's not just one sect of Sufism.
Of course, yeah.
And one sect which I reject is that when they go to the graveyards and, the saint or sheikh who is died, and they pray to him, which is violation of main Islamic Sharia law, belief in God, and you worship him and ask him for everything. Another thing is that everything is going wrong in Muslim world is because it's religious political things. The fight between the sectarian people. One sect says, oh, my imam is better than your imam. The other one says, no, I am going to follow my imam. And these imams, what they are doing, they are just playing games with the people. And that's where the problem starts. So I hope that Muslims all over the world would start practicing the original Islam that stops at Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, peace be upon him. And that's it. And that's what I am doing. I'm following only original Islam and nothing else. I don't follow any other man. Thank you. Thank you for everything.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, actually, you put your finger on something there, this idea of following the original Islam, because that's what everyone's always claiming to follow. And it's an argument about interpretation in many cases. Now, you're right, there are many different mystical orders, and often, be they for political reasons or, in fact, for purely religious reasons, you find members of one particular tradition condemning members of another for doing something that they say there is no evidence for in the original practice of the Prophet. Now, indeed, Sufism itself is on fairly shaky ground in terms of the tariqas, because their central claim is that the Prophet handed on some particular secret knowledge to one or the other of his elect followers, who then transmitted that knowledge to other people. But on the other hand, you have people who say, well, hang on, there's no such thing as secret knowledge. It's all there for everybody. And that's the central claim of the people who are opposed to many of the tariqa teachers. Now, this idea of visualizing the sheikh or claiming that you can only get things through your teacher, this is certainly an area for contestation. One of the most famous Naqshbandis of Syria in the 1830s and 1840s, Maulana Khalid, was particularly controversial because he claimed that to achieve a proper connection with your sheikh, you had to visualize his image alone in order to make that connection. This was extremely controversial in many circles. I don't even know whether the Naqshbandis still practice this, because the thing is there are so many different sorts of Naqshbandis, and often it comes down to the particular sheikh. So I see politics very much in the story, even if it's not about people trying to run a state. They're certainly trying to get followers and organize themselves. Now, religion and politics, well, this is the big question. I can't say it better than you, and I'll leave it at that. Oh, you said you wouldn't ask a question.
I haven't asked a question. I want to thank you for the wonderful lecture. The comment you made regarding the Dutch not being aware of Islam when they went there, it was a bit confusing to me. They must have been aware through their trade or going all the way around India at the time and their trade of spices and whatnot. How was this, if you can just expand on that?
No, they're aware of Islam. They're aware that people are Muslims, but they're either not particularly interested in relaying the details about their practices to readers back home, and indeed when they do, some of the earliest books from the early, from I think 1601, a description of the Moluccas, when they talk about their practices, they say they're Muslims, and then they append a Dutch translation of a Portuguese translation of a Latin translation of an Arabic text from the 11th century and say, look, it's all there, it's all the same stuff. So they're not looking with great interest at the precise details, and it seems that, in order to reconstruct what doctrinal arguments may have been going on, the precise forms of Islam or differences in opinion, then we have to sort of read against the grain of the Dutch reports because they didn't really know much about that. On the one hand, that's the people who wrote. But then on the other hand, in terms of pragmatics, so many Dutch people, and I should say the Dutch East India Company was not just Dutch people, there were Germans, there were Swedes, there were Danes, there were English, Scots, you name it, often ended up marrying locally, had ultimately, married as Muslims, had local children. There must have been people around who knew a bit more, but it just seems that the Dutch attitude, at least in the metropole, was there was literally the sense that a book on Islam would not sell. People weren't really interested in that. They wanted to know more about the progress of Christianity in the archipelago. And just as a sort of an interesting anecdote to this, there's a story, there's an account of a Morisco from Marrakesh who goes to the Netherlands in 1619, I think, and he's shown some texts that are brought back from the Moluccas. And according to his account and his conversation with the Dutch Orientalists there, they were all equally surprised to learn that the text that had been brought back was something to do with a mystical treatise. And so this guy, Ibn al-Hajri from Marrakesh, was first surprised that there were even Muslims out there, and he was another Muslim, and second, that they knew Arabic and that they were interested in mystical doctrines. So, but this was not a tariqa text, I should say. This was a philosophical text.
I think first of all, say that it's really an interesting lecture. I think all Muslims in Indonesia, they should know about this. Well, what I found is in Indonesia right now, it's most of Indonesian, their majority, they have this belief where it's based on Sunni. So, like you mentioned, most of in the early stage of Islam in Indonesia, that was Sufi influence there, right? So I was just wondering, what do you think will be the cause, why it's merged in a way that from Sufi to Sunni, Okay, well, the main point I'd like to make there is that
Sunni Islam, like Indonesia is remarkable for the relative lack of diversity, sectarian diversity in terms of juridical school, because there are various, first you have the difference between Sunni and Shia, and then among the Sunnis you have, now there are sort of 4 accepted schools of interpretation of the Quranic text and the Sunnah of the Prophet, right? The acts and sayings of the Prophet and his followers. Pretty much all Muslims in Indonesia are members of one school, and that's the Shafi'i school, which is also found in southern Yemen and also represented quite well in Egypt. But Sufism is not mutually exclusive from Sunnism, and indeed, for many, many people, Sufism was part of the package, right? But it was sort of like the elite part of the package. So, and indeed the members of the various brotherhoods always pointed out that they were members of the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. They were part of the Sunni community. And by and large, in most contexts, that's how people saw the Sunnah, right? That Sufism was a popularly accepted part of Sunni practice. However, that's where the people who call themselves Muwahhid, the Muwahhidun, or the Wahhabis as outsiders call them, differ markedly, and they say that there is no room in the Sunni tradition, that Sufism is absolutely a heretical innovation of later times, made by tricksters, and that who are just trying to control people, and that this should be done away with. So they're arguing that, that they're mutually independent categories, but really, for the vast bulk of Muslim history, and indeed in most Muslim countries, I think you could say, particularly if you went to Senegal, for example, the notion that to be a member of a Sufi order is not being Sunni is completely unheard of. Well, it's not unheard of, because there are certainly people who are claiming that, but they go against that. So yeah, they're not mutually exclusive categories.
Does anybody else have a question or comment?
Thank you, Michael. I want to ask you a question on colonial period.
Mm-hmm.
This is actually related to the questions from Pak Sumirat about Wali Songo.
Mm-hmm.
How was the Wali Songo represented by the Dutch during colonial time?
Okay. Well, actually, it's part of one of Snoek's students, a guy called Rinkes, Dua Adolf Rinkes, set about trying to write a series of articles on the Wali Songo. He was going to write the canonical book, if you like, on who these saints were, but he gave up after 4. And I don't know whether it's because he couldn't work out who the 9 exactly were, or whether other colonial business took his fashion. But what they largely did was they tried to collect, the various accounts of the Wali Songo and tried to make some sort of fact out of it, to try and work out exactly when one... And often all they end up with is a death date and a name, because there are often divergent stories. Although I think what's happening now in Indonesia is the stories are converging, right? You're getting agreed texts on who each wali is. But I think at the end of the 19th century, there are so many local traditions about the various wali that sometimes the story about one wali would fuse into the story of another. And there was no agreed text, I think you could say. Go on.
Was the ethnic identity of the Wali
an issue? Well, I think some Dutch scholars got very excited when they could say that one was more Indonesian than others, Sunan Kalijogo, for example. And in that tradition actually carries on into the anthropology of Clifford Geertz, a famous American anthropologist who wrote about Islam in Indonesia and Morocco. And indeed what he did was in order to compare Morocco to Indonesia, he picked 2 saints. And he said, we'll take the Wali Songo, we'll take Sunan Kalijogo as representative of everything that's Indonesian. He's a mystic, he's actually some sort of Shaivite, and originally he's a robber, and then he turns into a great saint. And then we've got, I think it's Ibrahim Luyushi in Morocco, a different saint, and he turns him into this aggressive desert saint. So in order to make that juxtaposition there. But everything that Geertz was writing was based on Dutch writings about the saints. But yeah, I mean, there's no... In terms of the identity, post-colonial Dutch scholars who were trained by colonial Dutch scholars there was a guy called De Dewes, writing into the 60s, 70s and 80s, was still always looking for what's the oldest text, what's the text, what's the one that's going to tell us the real story. And it often came down to issues of codicology, how old's the paper, when did it first turn up in Europe. But what he found is that the few texts that he could identify with Wali Songo they did not talk about syncretism, they did not talk about mixing with others. In fact, some of the earliest texts are very explicitly setting themselves up in opposition to local Javanese. There's one that has a series of question and answers which he attributed to, I think, Sunan Bonang, which has questions, if you are asked which is better, the religion of the Javanese or the religion of Islam, you have to say Islam. You shouldn't mix with the Javanese. So Mel Rickliffs has done a lot of work on this. The early texts don't seem to be composed by syncretists, but rather by people who are holding themselves apart from the local community. But then by the time you get to the 17th century, then you get a lot more, the texts become much more about, some of the older pre-Islamic texts could be interpreted as Sufi texts and Islamic texts as well.
He's closer to me. I'll go here.
This is about the first 440 years of confusion.
For all the study that scholars like yourself have done of the colonial and pre-colonial periods, what can we learn from that'll help us go forward now from the West understanding Islam?
Well, I think we have to treat Muslim statements about themselves seriously, and that we have to listen better, I think, and perhaps be more aware of where information comes from and has come from, and that it certainly hasn't worked out well when scholars have taken sides in particular debates. I think it's more clear perhaps with the British that they very much took the traditionalist side of the argument in Malaya and ended up sort of valorising one sort of group, whereas the Dutch valorised another group. But I think my overall feeling is it's fine to write about Islam, about Islamic history, but I don't think we should be in the business of prescribing any particular future and validating any particular viewpoint. Maybe that's putting myself out of it too much, but I don't think we should be in the business of telling Muslims what to do.
Thank you. I'm trying to understand what's happening with Islam in Indonesia right now. My Indonesian Muslim friends are quite baffled with the current phenomenon, and it's quite scary for them. And it's even scarier for me as an Indonesian non-Muslim. It's the Islamic radicalization that we are seeing now. Is it something new? Is it a phenomenon that is an impact of what's happening outside Indonesia in the Muslim world in general, or is it something that has been there for a very long time? You explained all the sectarian conflict, the conflict between different factions, in Islam as well as outside Islam in the history of Islam in Indonesia. But still, with all those explanations, I still see that there is like a significant gap between what happened in the past and what's happening now. And so, I don't know, is it something that has been there but is suppressed for a long time, but by different regimes, or or something happened outside Indonesia, but then we see the impact in Indonesia? In other words, are we seeing a Islamic revivalism, or is it a crisis in Islam? So it's.
I think I would say that there's nothing new in Islamic radicalism. There's always been sorts of Islamic radicalism. There's always been new teachings coming in, and sometimes labelled radical or sometimes not labelled radical. Some of the people that we talk about as reformists now were certainly radicals for their time, and not particularly. For example, the Padris are a really good example. Most literature now sort of says they were reformists. They wanted to purify society. And indeed, even some contemporary European observers said that they weren't such bad guys after all, what their interests, they were heading in the right direction. Indeed, some Dutch scholars in the 1860s described the Wahhabis, who they thought would never come back, as having turned Diriyah, their capital, into the Geneva of Arabia. And that was for them a good thing. So, but radicalism is not new. And I think that the point is that Indonesians, like Muslims in other places, have constantly been in contact with trends, new trends from throughout the Muslim world. Now, often those trends that they've been connected with have been connected to Mecca. What's the Islam of Mecca? What should be regarded or what is held up as the purest form? And so I guess the Saudi state, with its protection of the holy places, has a fair chance of representing what it regards as proper Islam to the rest of the world. That's not to say that it goes without criticism. Many Indonesians who go on the Hajj do not appreciate the restrictions that are placed on them, and certainly the Sufis do not appreciate the restrictions that are placed on them in the Hijaz. But yeah, the other thing is it's not just about Mecca. Indonesians didn't just start writing to Cairo in the late 19th century and start thinking about Cairo as another place of authority. In fact, there's now evidence that there was an Indonesian community there, although I was hoping to get the evidence, but then there was a certain revolution. There's a deed of Waqf, apparently, that indicates that there was an Indonesian community at Al-Azhar in the late 18th century. The person told me, they said, "You'll be really disappointed, it's really, really late." I said, "Oh, well, what, is that 1860? And they said, "Oh, no, in the 18th century." I was like, "That's really early for me." But what I find actually is there's lots of evidence in the story of seeking, what is the most valid Islam, of not just going to Mecca, but also sending missions and people to Cairo to ask questions. Now, Islam in Cairo, the political authorities have not always been the same. The other thing I'd like to point out, though, is that this is contested. The very vocal and prominent Arab minority in Indonesia, who are largely descended from people from Hadramaut in Yemen, there have been some Hadramis who've tried to say, well, actually, the first Arabs, the first people who brought Islam to Indonesia, all came from Wadi Hadramaut. There was even they've also tried, they've written genealogies that say that the Wali Songo were in fact all Arabs from Hadramaut. And some people accept this. Indeed, some people accept this because they don't like the idea that some of the Walis might have connections further north in a rather different and to them non-Muslim direction. Although we've got to remember that Islam was an important religion in China and Islamic trade was extremely important. So I'm sorry if I'm rabbiting on a bit, but just back to the Hadrami connection, it was very interesting. In the New York Times a few months ago now, there was an article on Tarim in Yemen, the Wadi Hadramaut. And sure, Hadramaut's the place where Osama bin Laden came from and his family, but it's also the place where the teachers of Tarim proudly claim to their many students from around the world, including from Indonesia, that this is where the Islamization of Indonesia started. It came from this basin. And what do they point out? They point out that the people of Tarim have always been more Sufi, more accommodatory, and not like that bin Laden crowd. So there are other places where Sufism and the past and accommodation are held up as exemplars. And you might be surprised to learn that, Yemen, the parts of Yemen, that the people talk that way too.
Last chance. Any other questions? Oh, you guys get them after. What do you think? Okay, we got a new voice over there. Okay, maybe two more. That'll kind of wrap us up, I think. It's okay, Michael?
Sure, that's fine. I can't promise a straight answer.
Thank you. I think it's a very interesting exploration about Islamic when you mention from the historical background of Islamic civilization. And when we talk about Islam, I think it's we talk about interpretation about Islam.
Yeah.
So with some question about law aspect of Islam that it described in Hanafi, Malik, Shafi'i, Hanbali, or the theological aspect like Sunni Shia, or the philosophical aspect like Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, or Mullah Sadra and Shatra, and also the Sufism perspective like Tasawwuf that you mentioned in your lectures, that I think, in my opinion, that the philosophical aspects and the Tasawwuf or Sufism aspects is more specific attention in universal doctrine of Islam. This radicalism is come from the other side of the Islam, that I think there is the discontinuity interpretation of fiqh or law in Islam, that until now we still use a 10th century of interpretation of fiqh. So I think there is no specific contextualization with the contemporary problem of Islam. So I really appreciate when you mention about the Tasawwuf, because it's represent one of the universal doctrine of Islam. I think when you mention or you try to explain Islam in historical background, I think it's more wise that if you combine it with the philosophical aspect of Islam, such as the tradition of philosophical like Ibn Sina or Mullah Hadis Ziwari that still alive in Iran like right now, but it's minority. Some of Indonesian, maybe the moderate of Indonesian perspective right now, it's a kind of interpretation of Sufism itself, but in a contemporary form. I think that's my suggestion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, just on that, I did mention early on that tariqah is only one part of the Sufi package, tasawwuf, and of course there's an extremely important philosophical tradition. And it was often claimed that real Sufism is the philosophical tradition, and that these tariqah guys are, how many people who are the critique always ran, well, how many of these people engaging in mixed gatherings with the lamps darkened and doing dancing, with to the beat of a drum? How many of them would, actually even be able to read a text? What's their knowledge of Islam based on? And it has to be said that the philosophical tradition, though, is not. There's not one Islamic philosophical tradition. Even if we talk about Islamic civilization, it's like there's one whole package that everyone has. Not everyone had access to the same tradition at the same times, and not every Islamic community has valorized or validated the same set of texts at the same time either. So even if you may have Avicenna being read in the Middle East, it doesn't necessarily mean that Avicenna was read very widely in Indonesia until recent times. Then again, there are great names like the aphorisms of Ibn al-Arabi are certainly well known in Indonesia. So you have a great mystic there whose works were very, very well known. But then again, the ideas, for example, the writings of al-Hallaj or the thoughts of al-Hallaj. I mean, people weren't making an equation between Mansur al-Hallaj and Siti Jenar until Massignon wrote that book in 1922, where he said, the story of Siti Jenar in Indonesia seems to be like the story of al-Hallaj. So there's also, what we have to look at is actually the colonial feedback loop, where studies of Islamic civilization, which are often valorized and read with great alacrity in Muslim societies, the studies of French and German and Dutch scholars, which talk about Islamic civilization, are extremely well received in translation in a lot of places. And people then go and look at the texts that perhaps that they hadn't necessarily been connected to. So it's, anyway, but it is really interesting. There's this philosophical soup out there, and I think the thing is that Indonesians, like Muslims of other places, I should say, not traditions, are very interested in dipping into that and taking and reading what interests them.
Any other final comment, Michael? Any other final comment you want to make, or?
Can I have some dinner?
We drained you? Okay. On behalf, please join me in thanking Professor Laffan, please. Thank you.